Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Just a friendly reminder for folks who enjoy the content and want to support the podcast that we have a Patreon for the podcast where we do book club, hangouts, and share private content that we don't share on social media. We also offer a wider range of products ranging from living soils, LED lighting, beneficial insects, organic fertilizers, and professional consulting at www.kisorganics.com. My guest this week is George Grant. George has degrees in horticulture from the University of Georgia and the University of Florida. He is the GGS Pro Technical Service Manager with Griffin Greenhouse Supplies. GGS Pro assists ornamental, edible, and hemp cannabis growers across the country with their cultivation issues ranging from sanitation, IPM, fertility, lighting, and water quality. GGS Pro fields over 17,000 grower-related calls and emails annually. This amount of valuable interaction helps Griffin collaborate with chemical vendors, academic researchers, and plant producers to implement change within the green industry. Now on to the show. Hey, George, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Tad. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, now you're good friends with Michael Alden, who's a prior guest who talked a lot about a variety of topics around photoperiod, internode spacing, and some of the cultural practices that could influence those things, light restriction. And he said that you're good friends with him from college. Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Sure. So Mike and I go way back. I have my background's in horticulture from University of Georgia and the University of Florida. So I am from the South. Don't really sound like it too much. I currently live in Golden, Colorado. I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate because I've been blessed with really good mentors. Basically, right after grad school, I met a man named Rick Yates, and he's very well known in the ornamental industry. He was the head of the technical department for Griffin Greenhouse Supplies. Griffin is a nationwide distributor for plant products, both on the hard goods and live goods side of things. We've been very heavily involved with CEA, ornamentals, and cannabis over the last several years. And Rick basically just took me under his wing and showed me all the things I didn't know and all the things that I could potentially know. So I've got a great team around me. Don't have enough. I've so many things great to say about Griffin and the family culture that they bring. But what I really love about my job is I tell growers this and they don't really like it, but I get to share all the success, but none of the stress of growing. I realized quickly in grad school that I couldn't sleep at night knowing I had a crop in the greenhouse. But I realized that I do love the problem solving aspects of helping growers. I have no idea what's going to happen when that phone call rings or that email pops up. It could be anything. And that's what I love about this job. So I get to learn a little bit about everything as it relates to crop protection, nutrition, cultural practices, you name it. And also at the same time, we get to understand what are the new trends that are developing across the various industries. So I'm very blessed and very grateful for my position.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you get to hear all of the challenges that are happening with the growers that you work with. What sort of commonalities do you see around that? Are there common issues or problems that seem to arise consistently?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's growing plants in general is not as cookie cutter as people may think. Every operation is different. Every culture, meaning the people that are involved, the stakeholders, everything is different. Also, the state in which they're growing in is different. So I would say as far as the major source of problems that we typically get is people have a problem and that could be pest or disease related and they don't know what tools they have available. And when I say tools, I mean both from a cultural aspect as well as a chemical aspect. As you know, cannabis is still relatively, even though people think it's got a very defined culture, and in some ways it does, but for most of the country, it's still relatively new crop. And from a legal side, it's very new. So state governments are still trying to figure out what pesticides can and cannot be used. I oftentimes see growers trying to use a product that isn't approved legally and then again they might use it in a way that's not that they shouldn't be using it on. I mean, if we you mentioned Mike and his research, which I think is very groundbreaking. A lot of the research coming out of academia relates to fertilizer and cultural practices nowadays, but there's hardly any research coming out on the crop protection side of things specifically to cannabis. So I'm fueling that. Whenever I get the opportunity to speak, I'm trying to tell growers to do internal trials, controlled trials, as well as our vendor partners. We work with basically every major vendor from a crop protection standpoint under the sun, and so I'm urging them to do controlled trials on cannabis specifically, because growers want to know what is working, what is not, and what is safe and what is not. So phytotoxicity concerns are a very common practice. A lot of times we grow in an indoor environment and growers may not understand how to apply a pesticide correctly in a very controlled environment versus a greenhouse or even outdoors. So each of those contextual factors play.
Well, let's cover that a little bit then. So if we're talking about a pesticide, and I guess it doesn't really matter what that pesticide is, and correct me here as we go, but want to make sure we're always applying to the label rate. We've read the MSDS or SDS around that product to know how to use it safely, and we have the proper PPE and protection in place, and that the application rate is established to give you maximum efficacy at the lowest concentration and the least risk of phytotoxicity. So it's always important to apply to application rate to avoid creating insect resistance to that, whatever that chemistry is, assuming it's a chemistry and not an oil. Anything you would change in those statements, or anything you would add to that?
No, but I would definitely agree with you. The label is the law, and that's something we stand behind all the time. And I'm not afraid to tell growers that as well. It's just, frankly, it's just, it is what it is. Resistance is a major issue regardless of what plant you're growing. I think what's advantageous for cannabis growers is most of the products that are approved for cannabis use are what we call quote unquote soft chemistry or microbial based chemistries. So your Bavarias, your Isarias, your azadiractins, and Bacillus, very important. So those active ingredients typically don't deal with resistance issues like we do with hard chemistry or conventional chemistries. So I think that's advantageous, but that doesn't downplay the fact that we should be rotating depending on the situation. I mean, I work with cannabis growers almost every single day, and I can tell you the main ones are going to be, it's going to be either it's going to be a root aphid, it's going to be a cannabis aphid, it's either going to be a thrip, spider mite, powdery mildew, or botrytis. And so there's a lot of overlap from what an ornamental grower will deal with, as well as a cannabis grower. Unfortunately, the toolkit is just much, much smaller when we're working with cannabis.
Yeah, well, you listed a whole bunch of different challenges in cannabis. Do you want to dive into any one of those in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's just talk about microbials for a moment. So most of the microbials that we use, they do very well in high humidity, relatively cool temperatures, high humidity environments. And that's almost exactly opposite of what we're trying to achieve in an indoor grow operation. We're usually shooting for high light, very low, extremely low relative humidity. And so things dry out. And that microbials work the same way. So when I'm working with a grower, it's very important they understand how to manage their HVAC system. So, and this actually kind of goes back to phyto as well. So a general rule of thumb when applying any type of pesticide is I want it to be less than 80 degrees in that growing environment, and I want relatively low humidity so it dries relatively quickly. Microbials work a little bit differently, though. They do want to be applied at a cooler temperature, but a slower drying condition or greater relative humidity allows for them to do better. If it's fungal based, they're just going to sporulate. If they're bacterial based, they're going to populate more, and they're going to stay on that insect for longer. So I try to work with growers and make sure they understand when they're doing an application or a series of applications that they're managing their HVAC system so they maximize the efficacy of those pesticides.
Yeah,
I mean, oils are a great example of something that can easily burn cannabis, and that temperature and light intensity sort of parameter needs to be dialed in. That's why a lot of growers are going. I mean, not just the only reason, but one of the reasons why people are going to dimmable LEDs or adjustable intensity LEDs is so they can lower the light intensity. So there's less actually light intensity or light stress potentially on that plant when a pesticide application is made until it's dried.
Yeah, I just want to remind folks too that oils and sulfur do not mix. And frankly, I think there's better options than sulfur in cannabis in most cases. But I just want to throw that out there as well. And one thing that you touched on with humidity, I wanted to talk about a little bit because I'm seeing people running a higher RH now that we're, as a community, more informed and learning and understanding VPD. So like I use the VPD chart from Dr. Greenhouse, Dr. Nadia Saba. I know there's a lot of great ones out there, but given that we're running, slightly higher humidity, at least in veg and through most of flower, does that allow for better usage of a lot of these pesticides then?
Yeah, I would say from a microbial standpoint, absolutely. Um, we don't want to, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we have greater pest pressure and disease pressure when we run higher relative humidities, but it's much better. Just it's we were going from like 20%, 40% relative humidity, incredibly low relative humidities to now 50 to 60, and even a little bit higher especially in a greenhouse situation. So I think it's better, just because we're not stressing out the plant as much.
Yeah, as a side note, I did an interview with Nicole Gauthier. I'm actually following up with her. She's a pathologist at the University of Kentucky, and she was saying that one of the two species of powdery mildew that infects in cannabis can actually sporulate at 40% humidity. So even lowering humidity, you're stressing the plant, and you're still at risk if you have this particular species of PM. You're creating optimal conditions for it to reproduce, which I thought was really interesting. But
I believe it. I mean, we get powdery mildew here in Colorado, and people think we're incredibly dry. It, the, I people need to think about, and I think I love how the cultures between ornamentals and cannabis is going. At first, I believe there was quite a bit of tension, but I think now we're starting to learn from each other as we get closer and integrated. And I think it's important because cannabis growers are going to need to learn more about greenhouse production as that becomes more of a norm. I mean, for example, with powdery mildew, we know just from greenhouse production that it rears its head most on the shoulders of the season. So from winter to spring, and then basically summer to fall. It's those transitional times where powdery mildew pressure just tends to skyrocket. So I like that we're learning from each other and communicating.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I wanted to just also touch on, you brought up a really good point around light intensity, because a lot of the research coming out by Dr. Bruce Bugbee now is showing higher light intensity can increase yields. And he's pushing the envelope pretty high in terms of PAR or PPFD. I would assume that as people start running higher light intensity, we do need to dim it down to avoid phytotoxicity. Because like when I do an application of like Cephaloyl X, for example, I don't always consider what my light intensity is because I have never really pushed it that high. But if I were to run a higher light intensity, I would want to, potentially dial it down. And also, do you want to talk about when we should be spraying during the light cycle? I think that's another important aspect, depending on the application.
Absolutely. Actually, this exact question came up today. In general, ideally, if I was in a greenhouse situation, I'd be ideally wanting to apply in the morning hours. So light intensities are relatively low. They're increasing, but they're relatively low. Humidity is relative. It can definitely start high and then start go down as the sun rises. But it's preferable to be in the morning because we still have cool enough conditions for phyto to be reduced. But then also we ensure that we're going to have it dried out. We're not going to go into the evening hours or dark time hours with wet foliage or wet flowers. That's never advantageous. Now, the flip side of that, the reason why it logistically doesn't always occur why spraying doesn't occur in the morning hours is because of REIs. So depending on the pesticide, it can range from anywhere from 4 hours to 12 hours, or even 24 hours, depending on the chemistry. Luckily, most of our organic or softer chemistries have very low REIs, so that does kind of free up the situation. But if I spray something, still have to follow the REI, and I can't handle that plant for X amount of hours until that REI is over.
And for those unfamiliar, REI stands for return entry interval. So it's the amount of time before you can go back into that space after spraying whatever the particular pesticide or spray was. So just want to let folks know. Well, interesting. So like you said, you get a lot of stuff around, it sounds like pathogens. What about with pest pressure? Like, are you seeing a lot with, I don't know, hemp russet right now, or any particular mite pressure?
Someone once asked me, is there ever a situation when you're an indoor grower where you can completely 100% eliminate pests? And I told them it's most likely not feasible, because somebody is either entering or exiting that building, or product is either entering or exiting the building. And that's the sole reason why we end up having an infestation. A lot of these indoor operations are very buttoned up, very, very tight, but unfortunately, employees do a great job of kind of transferring pests into a facility. I mean, broad mites, spider mites, hemp russet mite, they're all great hitchhikers. They will jump onto, or whenever an employee rubs up against that plant that has that pest, they do a great job of clinging onto them and then moving throughout the production space. So obviously sanitation and or trying to prevent any type of pest entering the facility is very important. Yeah, I mean, hemp russet mite has been around for some time. I mean, I think it was a really big issue maybe 2 years ago when it started really affecting everyone. But the reality is once you have a hemp russet mite issue, what I'd like to tell growers, similar with broad mites are just as hard because you can't see them. Hemp russet mite, very difficult to see. Broad mites, same way. You typically see the damage first, and then you realize you have an infestation. So a lot of what I don't, and this is going to probably really make some people not feel good, but the best way to start out with an issue like that infestation is culling plants. And when I say culling, I mean throwing out plants that have the highest pest pressure. You are going to spend more money and resources and have a much uphill battle trying to solve an infestation when you've got just a select few plants that are the source of that problem. You really need to throw out or destroy those plants and then start your pesticide applications. A lot of people don't consider doing that because they want to try to save every plant they can, but it's just something to think about, especially if you're growing a large amount of plants. Feel free to throw away a few plants if they're the most symptomatic. Physically reducing inoculum is actually a very powerful tool I don't see enough growers use.
Yeah, you don't hear that suggested very often. So you're saying if there's a hot spot in a room, rather than trying to spray it, or let's just say you're in flower, mid-flower, to where you can't really, pistil growth is already happening, you can't really spray anything. Beneficials take a little bit longer. I mean, the classic example is by the time you have webbing, if you're in flower with spider mites, it's already too late. Like you're not gonna be able to fix it. So you're saying just take them out, reduce that overall pressure, and then come up with a plan for the rest of the crop.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said it very well. It works in the same way in the ornamental side of things. And cannabis is not necessarily able to do this, but on ornamentals, let's say I've got a sweet potato vine, very common ornamental, that is an attractant to a lot of different pests that also affects cannabis. So when I've got broad mites and mites in general are really interesting, because what you'll see when you look at the damage is that the older growth, more established growth, doesn't seem that symptomatic or damaged. But as you move up into the plant to the more systematic areas, you actually see the damage get worse and worse. And what's happening is the mite species are actually moving up to the new growth. They're reproducing in greater number and causing more damage. But what we sometimes do in ornamentals, if it's allowable, is I cut off the affected portions of the plant where those mites are present and just basically destroy that material essentially I'm pinching it. I'm pinching that plant and then allowing the lateral growth, the underneath growth, to then expand, and the mites are not present there. So that's a small cultural method, and it doesn't really make sense for most cannabis situations unless I was talking about mother stock. That might make sense in that situation.
Yeah, if you're early enough in veg too that you can just kind of lower your canopy, I could see that if you did across the board. But yeah, I've always thought of hemp russet or broad mite damage as sort of that twisted new green growth, a little bit lighter green coloring too, almost like a iron deficiency. But then the leaves will do this sort of twisting distortion to them. And then you really need to get out your scope. And make sure you can't just use your phone. You need like a dyno light or something that's going to give you a little better magnification and a little better clarity to really see it, at least in my experience.
Oh yeah, 100%. When we work a lot off photos and phone calls, and so people get really creative on their adjectives they use to describe symptoms. And some growers aren't comfortable sharing photos, which is perfectly fine. Um, but what I like to think about, what I like to ask the growers, what's the uniformity of the issue? When I walk into a situation, first thing I want to know is it an abiotic issue or a biotic issue? Well, everything we've been talking about thus far are biotic issues. They're caused by living things. And typically when we have a biotic issue, the uniformity is not incredibly uniform. So if it was a fertilizer issue or a nutritional issue, it's going to affect all the plants relatively the same way because they're all receiving the same input. Same with phyto, like a phytotoxicity event. If I sprayed something and it was way too hot, or I played something and it wasn't the correct rate, it's going to damage those plants uniformly. Thus, that makes me think, okay, this is going to be an abiotic issue, whereas biotic issues tend to be much more localized or spread out more randomly throughout a production area.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to point out some other things to consider, like it could be an abiotic issue if you had like a fan, for example, in a corner that was creating a different air pocket that maybe allowed PM to start growing. So your abiotic issue could be creating your biotic problem to a certain extent. And a lot of times plant stress, whether that's from fertilizer deficiencies or excesses, can lead, especially around nitrogen, can lead to higher pest pressure. So these things are all really interconnected, just making it way more complicated. But you're right. You have to be a detective when you walk in the room. Just like if you're looking at it from a nutrient perspective, we want to know, where is this issue occurring? Is it the entire plant? Is it a mobile nutrient? Is it an immobile nutrient? I always like people to send me photos of the issue and then also the whole plant and even the whole room, so we can really get an idea of what's going on.
I could give you an entire album of poor photos. I don't know what it is, but we just get, I mean, and it is what it is, but it's amazing some of these one leaf photos on the hand or just a very blurry photo. But if you're ever working with us or any technical specialist, please just take the time to send a few clear photos. And like I said, Ted, whole plant photos. We want to see the tops, we want to see the bottoms. Oftentimes, if something, especially nutritionally, if something's affecting or disease related, if something's affecting the top, we want to look at the roots immediately to see if that's, like you said, the primary issue leading to a secondary issue that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's another great point. People should absolutely kick a pot out of the container and take a look at the roots, or dig into their bed or their container and see what's going on there. I think people forget about that a lot of times. I forget about it sometimes. But there's a lot of root pathogens that we need to rule out. And so that's a great suggestion. Um, cool. Well, what are you seeing around? So we've talked a lot about like pest pressures and things like that, but what sort of cultural practices are you seeing being implemented that are being most effective, or giving growers the best chance of success?
Let me tell you what not is not being implemented,
Okay.
because I think that's more important. The things that these are standard practices that are used in the ornamental side that I believe should be utilized or at least adopted and trialed on the cannabis side of things. One is called DIP and one is called DIF. So we have DIP and DIF. I'll first talk about DIF first. So we can manipulate plant stretching or architecture by adjusting the average daily temperature, daytime temperature, and average nightly temperature. The difference between those averages, if there's a more positive diff, meaning there's a greater day temperature than a night temperature, the greater that difference, the more we're going to get in plant stretching. The less difference we get, so if I had a diff of 0, meaning that my average day temperature and average night temperature are the exact same, then we can basically reduce stretching, or even in situations, this is primarily done in indoor situations, where I can have a negative diff. I can actually have a higher night temperature than my daytime temperature, and I can create more of a stunted plant. I am not seeing that trialed, and I would love to see how that affects plant, basically vegetative architecture as well as flower architecture. So that's diff, and that's a very common practice used in ornamentals. Something that's a slight offset of that is called dip, DIP. And what happens is, and this is primarily more important for greenhouse or outdoor situations, is that we know from research that the first few hours, about 3 hours as the sun is rising, lower light intensities and the quality of the light is different. And the majority of plant stretch actually occurs in the first 3 hours of daybreak. And so what growers will do on the ornamental side is they will actually drop their temperatures in the greenhouse by about 5 degrees lower than what their average night temperature is. So we've got the sun rising for about 3 hours, and during this time the plant is starting to wake up and starting to become photosynthetically active. But because of the light intensity itself and the quality, it's wanting to stretch very, very much so. And so we can reduce that ability, or that plant's ability to want to stretch, by dropping that temperature and creating sort of a cold stress to prevent that stretch from happening. So those are two cultural practices I don't see used, and I don't even see it cited in literature related to cannabis yet, but I foresee that happening in the future.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm familiar with diff, though I haven't really thought of the implications within cannabis, which is kind of crazy when you say it like that, because it does seem worth trialing. And the dip thing I hadn't even heard of. So yeah, I hope people would take that up as some research, because I think that could be really interesting. I don't know of anyone running a negative diff in cannabis. And I also wonder how CO2 plays a role, if any, in the fact that we have such great amounts of CO2 production happening at night. Especially in these living soil beds, which is sort of the realm that I work in. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I need to think about that a little bit. Thank you for sharing that. What other cultural practices are you seeing really being maybe done wrong, or things that you hear continually that are just little mistakes that you think people could avoid?
Well, I think overwatering cannabis can easily be an issue, and underwatering cannabis can easily be an issue. A lot of research that's going to come out in the next couple of years is they're going to use certain crops as model crops for cannabis. Poinsettia, like I said, Michael Alden he's equated kind of poinsettias as a model crop for poinsettia for cannabis, and they do have a lot of overlap. But poinsettia is a crop that doesn't like a lot of change. When I work with a lot of poinsettia growers, and I tell them, if you're going to be a dry grower, be a dry grower. If you're going to be a wet grower, be a wet grower. Do not change don't change your tactics really midway through the crop. Now, I know a lot of people do dry down steering, and there's a lot of information regarding that. But in general, if we're talking just mass production of cannabis, you're safer being more routine in your irrigation practices. And I think one way people are sort of getting around that, or providing some buffer to poor irrigation management, is converting to peat. I mean, peat moss, as far as a growing media, has become much more accepted over the last couple of years before the traditional ways of growing, and still are very prominent as core and grodan or rock wool. And obviously living soil, as you said, that's a complete different situation. But I do see a lot of growers converting to peat, both from a moisture management standpoint reason, and as well as from a nutritional standpoint. It obviously has a much higher CEC or cation exchange capacity, meaning it holds on to nutrition much more heavily compared to something like core or grodan, which is relatively inert.
I mean, I like peat just because the lower pH allows me to front load a lot of nutrients into the soil mix prior to planting, which is something with core where you're already starting at 7. Most of the inputs that I want to add are cations, or they're alkaline. It just pushes my pH out of range. That's my biggest reason for liking peat. And I think it's more sustainable than people realize. I've seen some interesting research around the replenishment of peat bogs. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think you could easily make the argument for it over cocoa coir in a lot of ways with the amount of fossil fuel and ecological damage associated around core production.
Yeah, well, whatever input you use for your growing media, it's one of the most important ones. So whoever you're buying it through, it needs to be a very quality product. It needs to go through a very rigorous QA QC process, um, because you don't want product that unfortunately, let's say, I mean, core, for example, there are some core sources that would not be buffered, meaning they haven't been leached, typically with either clear water or calcium nitrate, to basically rinse out the excessive salts that are in that media during the processing of that media. So it just, I think peat in general, it's been around for so long, and a lot of the major producers of peat, they have very good processes, and typically the quality is reliable. I do like that, and I like that as well.
Yeah, I think the quality of cocoa coir has gotten a lot better over the years. I think some of those inconsistencies have improved, but yeah, I've never been one to use a lot of cocoa coir in any of my mixes, so it's not something I have as much experience with. I've looked into other options, and you are seeing more options showing up from like wood pulp, the wood pulp industry. But I haven't been able to get the same quality of growth or production that I can with peat moss. And until I can get something to replace it, I mean, there's somewhere you could potentially reduce the amount of peat moss. They can replace, say, like 20 to 30% of the peat in your mix. But they're not able to fully replace it yet. But I hope we get there with new substrates.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we're getting off topic here, but Brian Jackson from NC State, I mean, he is spearheading the research for, I would say, uncommon amendments. I don't know if it's specifically, I've got a very good relationship with Brian, but I don't know if he's specifically looking at cannabis, but he is, if anyone's interested in wood fiber or anything that's non-traditional peat amendments or soulless media products, definitely it's worth giving him a research.
Yeah, I'll have to hit you up for an introduction later after the
Yeah,
podcast.
absolutely. I'm sure he'd love to come. He's a great guy.
That'd be great. Um, Very cool. Well, then what, I guess I want to dive a little bit into what sort of products do you find you tend to recommend the most for folks that are interested in utilizing, products in their grow. I realize that's not for everyone. We've kind of talked about some of the more general things, but what if we got a little more specific into some of the things that you tend to generally recommend more frequently than others?
We're talking about from an IPM standpoint or nutritional standpoint.
I mean, we can do either, really. Why don't we start with IPM, because we've kind of been talking about IPM.
Sure. Um, well, it once again depends on the state. So, a couple of examples of really good states that are doing an active job of updating lists and providing publicly available list of active ingredients or specific products that are approved would be like New York, Colorado, Oregon. Those are kind of in my mind, they're the role model for, I would hope most states eventually move to actually publishing lists and updating them of products that can be used. A lot of the time it is a wild goose chase. I mean, we'd have to sometimes call in to state government or regulatory agencies, and it's really hard for them to want to give us an answer because frankly, maybe they don't know, or the law hasn't been written enough with guidance for them to be able to give us a recommendation. So, and I hate that. I hate that sometimes we can't, the government's not helping us to help growers. And sometimes the growers have a problem. They don't know what solutions they can legally use. So that's never a good situation. But that aside, most of the products that I see that are on these sort of approved state lists are going to be your Bavaria bassiana products, your Isaria formosia products, all your Bacillus products. So Bacillus subtilis, Pumilus, Amblicae fascians. I'm using all these scientific names, but these are the kind of the main staple active ingredients that are utilized by cannabis growers. And when we take kind of microbials out of the equation, then we have oils and soaps. Those play an incredibly powerful tool. Mealybugs aren't really a major issue in cannabis, hardly ever seen them. But soaps play a major role for mealybugs. And then for oils, those play a major role for pretty much all of our insects under the sun and all of our miticides. I mean, there really is no good miticides out there other than oils, and so that's going to be a staple in every grower's operation. Um, Taking all those microbials out of the situation, we still have oxidizers, and this is more on a disease prevention standpoint. But your Sanidates, Zerotols, any of your hydrogen peroxide, peracetic acid products, those are incredibly valuable, both from a biofilm and algae prevention standpoint. We got to remember, wherever there's water and fertilizer, there's going to be algae and biofilm. And that, I don't care if you're in an indoor operation or outdoor operation, that's going to be a problem. And it becomes literally a physical and equipment problem for anyone using drippers or hoses or piping, et cetera. So injecting continuously or periodically injecting our Sanidates or Sanidate or Zerotal or hydrogen peroxide peracetic acid products, it's a good way to prevent that algae and biofilm coming in, but also they're incredibly versatile fungicide and bactericidal properties. So I do see some growers solely relying on something like Zerotal or Sanidate 12.0, because Sanidate 5.0 isn't labeled for plant contact. But Zerotal, for example, very broad label, see that used a lot, both in fogging applications, foliar applications, and drenching applications as their sole sort of product for disease prevention.
And with the fogging and things like that, are you seeing any phytotoxicity with those types of products?
So actually, Zerotal is fairly safe. It's amazing. I mean, it's. I'm not going to drop any names, but do know some very reliable growers who have done some internal trials with Zerotal, and I mean they're spraying it all the way to harvest. And not having a degradation on THC levels or cannabinoid levels. Would be curious how it. I would like to see some controlled studies though, because it is an oxidizer. It does have to have some chemical impact on terpenes and cannabinoid content. But I would just love to see where that threshold is and what it actually does. But as far as Phyto is concerned, I mean, it's all about rates. So it's important that you read the label and do. I always try to preach this, but doing small scale trials can save you a lot of money. And unfortunately, growers don't do that. They don't just mix up, 1 gallon here and there, spray a few plants, see what happens. But I do encourage growers to do that, especially as they're just establishing rates that work for them. But in general, Zerotal can be fairly safe if the rates are correct and the application process is correct. I mentioned fogging. You brought up fogging. Fogging or ULV, ultra low volume equipment or applicators, is becoming very, very popular. It's been. I mean, Dram is. I'm not going to lie. Dram has spearheaded this. They've got the best quality foggers on the market, and they are doing the due diligence to understand how to actually apply it in a safe way. And I'm seeing a lot of indoor growers use like an autofogger or a mini autofogger by Dram. I mean, I don't know a grower who's invested in one and not liked it. It's just great because you basically mix it up, set the timer, set it in the room, and you're good to go. It reduces quite a bit from that employee safety standpoint that hits home there, but also it's just not labor intensive. It's nowhere near labor as intensive as getting on PPE and getting a backpack sprayer on and spraying plants in the evening. No one really wants to do that. So ULV technology is, I think we're just kind of in the beginning stages of it. But I think it can be very good in a lot of different situations. It typically tends to reduce the chances of phyto because we're ultimately using less chemical per square footage, and the particle size itself is much smaller. So we're not getting, when I look at phyto, for example, what oftentimes happens is you have a congregation of liquid or active ingredient on the edges of the leaf because it's all kind of just dripping down into that area and accumulating. And that's where the phyto damage can occur. But when you fog something, it's uniformly getting those particles at AI across the entire leaf surface, and we don't have that puddling effect. So that in essence does prevent phyto in that way.
Now you have to be careful with what products, like you mentioned a bunch of microbial solutions at the beginning. I'm not aware of any that can go through a fogger. Just to let folks know, and maybe I'm wrong here, but in my experience, the foggers pretty much destroy all, even the bacillus species, from what I understand.
So luckily, there are different types of foggers. Some are thermal based, and some are basically using such high pressure and putting it through such a fine screen that it's kind of creating that small particle effect. So mini autofoggers, for example, pulse fogger or biopulse foggers. Pulse foggers are thermal, but there's a biopulse fogger by Dram that basically, I'm not going to go into it, but basically allows us to put microbials through it. Autofoggers,
Oh,
they're non-thermal. They can be used, they can use microbials and softer chemistry. Now, we put together fogging
hmm.
charts for growers. So if you buy a Dram, some sort of fogger through Griffin, we'll put together a customized chart for you. So you tell us the square footage of your production space, and we can tell you what products are properly labeled for fogging and the rates to use them at. And that's something specific to Griffin that no other distributor does. But that aside, we can. It just depends on the fogger itself. We can use
Oh, I wasn't
microbials.
aware of that.
Some do get broken down.
Oh, that's really interesting. One thing I want to touch on with microbials, because you mentioned, a bunch of different species, everything from Bavaria to Iceria, Bacillus, things like that. There could be a big difference, I think, in quality and efficacy based on not just where you source it, but also the species itself. So we can't assume that all Bavaria is the same, all Bacillus subtilis is the same. And I think that needs to be taken into account. I mean, just taking Bavaria as an example, I know like um, the Bioceres product, for example, has a very specific range of humidity and heat and cold temperatures, drought conditions that they can handle and thrive in. And then you could look at a different Bavaria product and say, okay, well, maybe because it's a different species, it may do slightly better or worse in a given environment. So I think it's worth trying out different ones, kind of be looking at spore count, but not taking it to be, the Bible, because what says on the label is not always what's in the package, but it at least give you an idea of whether or not this could be a viable product.
I 100% agree with you. I mean, for me, I'm not a sale. I don't work in sales at all. I only just try to provide solutions and try to be unbiased as possible, just given the situation. So oftentimes a grower will ask us, okay, well, you know, we see there's a lot of different Bavaria products or azadirachtin products out there, or whatever it may be. Which one should I go with? And well, I go, okay, well, how much is let's look at cost. That's always a good parameter to look at. So we like to do cost and use analyses. So what's the cost per gallon or cost per pound of AI or whatever it may be? That's something that's a very quick calculation we do all the time just to get just to let the grower understand. Okay, well, this is more in my budget range, and I'm willing to maybe jeopardize some maybe level of quality to make sure that I'm still applying the right amount of active ingredient given my price range.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think about like, what do I want to have in my pantry as a grower? This is something I've been thinking more and more about lately. What sorts of tools, let's say with IPM, would you want to keep in your pantry?
Well, I would say definitely an oil. With what's available, I'd have a bacillus as my fungicide. I'd have also trichoderma, so like root shield, for example, very common sort of inoculant. And when we talk about all these microbials, they should really be used preventatively. I mean, it's like BCAs, biological control agents. We should go into this with the mentality and perspective of this is going to be, I'm putting this out to prevent anything that develops. These software chemistries, they're just not really meant to be a come from behind product or a knockdown product. Some of them do have some of those characteristics, but it's always better to be using these preventatively, proactively rather than reactively. But I think we've named some of the major ones I would definitely have. There's a lot of conventional chemistries that I wish would be accepted in cannabis use just because they would, I think, be a game changer, especially on the fungicidal standpoint. I think with
Mhm.
insecticides, there really isn't. There's a fine line between hard chemistry and soft chemistry, but when we move to fungicides, there's definitely some that are in that kind of gray area that are currently used or labeled for edible use that I could easily see be used in cannabis use.
Hmm. Yeah, so you mentioned you'd want an oil, um, like for example, for Annabacillus. So like for me, I would put an oil, a horticultural, some sort of horticultural oil, like you mentioned. Um, I really like Bavaria. I really like Trichoderma. I haven't used a lot of Bacillus species from a from a pesticide or prevention aspect. I've only used them for like nutrient cycling and those sorts of like benefits. So that's interesting that you mentioned that. Um,
I will say, yes, there are kind of, you'll see these sort of soil, and their its labeling is very is an interesting art, I will say. But there are certain things that are labeled as soil amendments or soil inoculants that will have a
mhm.
variety of different Bacillus species that you will see do have um, they do have pesticidal properties. If you look in other fungicides that have those active ingredients, the producer of that product just cannot legally make those claims, or they'd have to change the labeling itself.
Sure, sure.
But I will say with Bavaria, and this is actually with oils too, a lot of these microbials can be tank mixed, and there's symbiotic relationships. I'll say synergistic relationships with each other. So Bavaria tank mixed with azadirachtin. Azadirachtin is an extract from neem oil, and it's an IGR, an insect growth regulator. Pairing these are really, it becomes a very powerful and broad spectrum application. The reason why is that most of these microbials, either Bavaria, either fungal or bacterial based, is that we're trying to ultimately coat the insect or mite or whatever we're trying to go after. We're trying to coat them and get as much of that active ingredient on them as possible. Because what happens is that if it's fungal based, it's going to ultimately sporulate inside that insect and kill it. If it's bacterial based, typically what happens is they actually if they get wet, then it can dissolve and dissolve in through a membrane like that. But also, what I like about bacteriums or bacterial-based pesticides is that when they eat they eat the foliage that has the bacterium in it, they're ingesting it that way. But either way, if I pair it with an azadirachtin, an IGR, insect growth regulator, it keeps that spore on there for longer. Like aphids, I mean, any of our major insects, they're going through molting processes. I mean, they're continuously trying to molt to ultimately become adults. But if we can use an IGR to prevent them from molting, they can't actually physically shed the spores or inoculum we're putting on them. And so that's why it's a great combination. That's a very common program we recommend. And typically we're doing that on a 5 to 7 day interval as far as reapplication interval.
Yeah, that's really useful. One thing that I was thinking of while you were talking about this that we haven't mentioned is nematodes. Um, I did a recent podcast with Julie Gresh from Bioworks talking a lot about nematodes, and I just recently made a recommendation of the SF or Steiner Nemefeltiae, I mispronounce it, nematodes, specifically as a preventative because especially in living soils or when you have any compost fraction, or any organic matter in general, you're probably going to, at the very least, have fungus gnats. Not to mention the numerous other things that these nematodes work so effectively on. They play nicely with Bavaria and other microbials. So, like for me, that would go in my pantry too. Now that we're talking about things that I love to have as a part of a maintenance IPM program.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't get me started on BCAs. That'd be a whole other talk. I mean, Julie's fantastic. That's why I love also about my position. I get to interact with all these really good professionals and these different vendors. But like you said, Steiner Nemefeltiae, and there's other different beneficial nematodes out there, depending on what we're after. I love beneficial nematodes, specifically SF species, because it goes after the thrip pupa. So a lot of people don't understand this, but when thrips, they basically have two larval stages, and then when they want to pupate, meaning that they want to become an adult, they'll actually drop to the soil surface. And it's at that point the nematodes actually become very beneficial there. So they play a very key role for both fungus gnat, but fungus gnat, even shore flies, and thrip control. Now, this is a tool, it's not chemical, but I'm seeing growers, not enough growers use it, but I'm starting to see ornamental growers, massive ornamental growers use it. And it's yellow sticky tape, not cards. So yellow sticky cards, everyone's probably familiar with that. They've seen it in an operation on a bench right above the canopy. A yellow sticky card is meant for scouting. It's really meant to see what is present that's flying around. Okay. But yellow sticky tape, it literally comes in several 100-foot rolls. You can wrap that between benches, and then we have actually a physical way of reducing the disease, the insect pressure. And that works really well. I mean, it really, really works well. I wish I could share my screen. I'd show you a photo of several operations using it, especially in the Southeast where fungus gnats are just out of control. They fill every square inch of that sticky tape. So that's a cool little cultural tool. I don't see enough growers using it. Beneficial Insectary produces it, and they also produce these clips that are very helpful to attaching them to structures. But definitely something to look into.
Yeah, we work with Catchmaster, who makes a lot of these type of cards, and I've seen the roles in facilities, though, actually mass trapping, kind of what you're describing. The one I was in, it was primarily root aphids at the time, and they were very prolific, and you could see them all over the tape. In
The
fact, we
winged
were
adults?
brushing.
Oh, that's a big issue then.
Yeah, we were brushing them off of ourselves after our Tyvek suits as we were walking out of the room. It was a lot. And one thing I learned on that one that was kind of interesting is they couldn't figure out why there were dead winged adult brood aphids um on the buds themselves, like on what people call sugar leaves, and essentially I talked to Suzanne about this. What she said was happening was they were actually going up too close to the light, dying, and then falling back down and landing there. So it wasn't any sort of IPM practice that they had that was killing these, which was they had guessed some different bacterias possibly or other things. It was really just the mechanical action of flying up into the lights and coming back down and landing. But yeah, pretty crazy to see on that scale. Um, it's
Interesting.
tough. Root aphids are tough. Like, I mean, it was a good
If you,
facility. I'm not throwing them under a bus. Like it's a problem that's once you have it, it's very hard on the commercial scale to get rid of.
yeah, absolutely. It's the best way to solve it is prevent it. Root aphids can be a really bad one. Problem is they create an economic loss, but they don't kill the plant typically. They're just really they never allow your plants to really reach maximum yield or maximal progression because they stress out the roots from day one. What I see as far as primary control mechanisms for that, if allowed, would be a Botanigard or a Bavaria product that's labeled for drenching, tank mixed with an azoractin that's also labeled for drenching, and doing a full volume substrate drench, literally to almost leach, basically to leach. In some certain situations and states, pyrethrins can be used, and you would never catch me recommending a pyrethroid for aphid control on the ornamental side because there's just so much resistance to that sort of chemistry. But on the cannabis side of things, we haven't used pyrethrins again and again and again on root aphids. So there are certain states that do allow like a pyrethroid drench, and then there's only a few pyrethroid products that I'm aware of that actually have a drench label. So Pyganic would be an example of one. That is, I have seen that be effective.
Hmm. Yeah, I've never really messed with pyrethrins. I will say that I'm excited for this granulated Bavaria product from Bioceres. It's actually something I'm using right now in my garden because it can be incorporated into the media, and then you get a slower release of Bavaria. And the issue with the root aphids is, I mean, that's a great suggestion with the Botanigard, but I don't feel like the Bavaria spores, are really making it to the bottom of the container, and it's really those holes in the bottom of the container where the water seeps out that's the problem. It's same with fungus gnats. Like, that's the real problem location that there really isn't a great solution for, I feel like, in a lot of cases. So I think incorporating the media might be a good option for really getting Bavaria down in throughout the whole container to help with the root aphids. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, with fungus gnats, we typically see them in the top 1 to 2 inches of soil. And so when I'm talking to a grower who's new to nematodes, for example, I don't tell them to drench the entire media because really the thrip pupa and the fungus gnat larvae, they're in that just top layer of soil. So it's just
Hmm.
more of like a quick watering. I don't want them to waste chemical or product. But when it comes to rudivirids, like you said, they do easily, and that's how they'll use it as a transport, is when someone's a heavy waterer or they're leaching or whatever it may be, they'll flush out the bottom of the container between of the holes, and then they'll just work their way to another pot. What I do see some growers, and this I don't want to harp on pyrethroids because it's not very commonly used in cannabis or accepted in cannabis. But what growers will do is they'll physically do that. They'll leach their pots to force the root aphids to want to leave the exit holes, and then they will spray between the pots. And this is real. I don't think this makes sense for a large scale, but for a smaller operation, I can see that making sense somewhat.
I'd never heard of that. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I feel like we've been talking for a little while. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we sign off for this one?
No, I'm sorry. I get really excited. But yeah, no, I really appreciate the opportunity. And if anyone ever wants to just reach out to GGS Pro, which is the technical arm of Griffin. We're happy to help you any way we possibly can. And, we try to learn from you as well. I've talked about all the great things in my position and the people I work with, but I also get to work with every different type of grower. I try to be an educator at heart, but honestly, we continue learning because of the things we learn from growers. So if you just even want to call and pick our brain, we're going to just be prepared, because we're going to ask you questions. So we try to understand what you're doing and what's working and what's not. So please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good to know as a resource for growers. And just to kind of piggyback on that, I find that when people reach out to me, like a lot of times I may not have the answer, but just having that network within both cannabis and horticulture and being able to reach out to people at these other companies or universities, your network is obviously very valuable. To be able to find an answer is really the best thing, because then everyone learns.
Yeah, there's a lot of people smarter than me out there, and I'm glad I get to interact with them on a daily basis sometimes.
Yeah, are there any available resources, like you mentioned that you have these fogging charts? Are there other things that are like I could go to the website right now and check out, or are they all things that you guys keep until the grower reaches out? Or how do I find out about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to go onto the Griffin Greenhouse Supplies website. We have a tab dedicated to GGS Pro, the technical team, and we try to talk as much as we can as far as public speaking events, all the major trade shows, as well as we're writing as well. So we pretty much have a bulletin for every major problem you might run into, and some of the more obscure ones as well. So there are online articles. I would definitely start with the website, but you can also just email us at ggsprotech@griffinmail.com. Easiest way to get in contact with us.
Cool. Well, thank you again for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you.
That was George Grant, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review, and give us a follow on Instagram and YouTube. And don't forget, at Kiss Organics, we have a wide range of products we offer on our website, ranging from soils, amendments, beneficial insects, soil test analysis, and consulting. Thanks for listening.